Okay, so how many of you binge watch shows on Netflix or some other service? You know, where you watch a whole season during one weekend. Come on, fess up. My current guilty pleasure of late has been watching a series called Below Deck on Bravo. It's a reality show, TV series about a crew on a charter yacht in the Caribbean and how they constantly bicker and fight with one another and complain about all the rich people who charter the yacht on which the crew works. And because they share tight quarters and actually live with the people that they work with 24/7, it makes for a lot of drama. The book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is kind of like a soap opera, starting with Abraham. Remember, Abraham's wife Sarah could not get pregnant, so she offered Abraham her maid Hagar as a surrogate without ever asking Hagar what she thought about the whole arrangement. And then later, when Sarah miraculously has a child of her own in her own age, she nags her husband Abraham to kick Hagar and her son out. Then Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac marries a woman named Rebekah, who has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And then Rebekah connives with her younger son Jacob to take away the inheritance from the older son Esau by deceiving Isaac, who is blind in his old age. Did you notice how us chronologically gifted folks do not seem to fare well in these biblical stories? Then Jacob gets paid back for his deception of his father and his betrayal of his brother by getting tricked himself by his own uncle Laban into marrying Leah, the less attractive older sister to Rachel, the younger daughter of Laban that Jacob really has the hots for. Are you keeping track of all this? Are you still with me? Then Jacob has 12 children through a combination of his 2 wives and their 2 handmaids. And I always felt kind of sorry for Jacob because I know maintaining one marital relationship is challenging enough. But trying to juggle 4 partners has got to be insane. Then the older offspring of Jacob and the less favored women are jealous of their favored younger brother Joseph, who is the son of Jacob and the real love of his life, Rachel. And so the older brothers plot to kill Joseph. And then they in turn decide to sell him off to slavery in Egypt. But you know what they say about karma? It comes back to haunt them, and the joke is on them. Because their attempt at revenge actually lands Joseph the plum job of being the number 2 man in all of Egypt. And puts him in a position to exact revenge on his older brothers. So we have these multiple generations of one family of deception and bitterness and sexual violence and so on. And that's why I compared this story to a soap opera of biblical proportions. But now here is how the book of Genesis ends. We read it this morning. Joseph is in a prime position to get the ultimate revenge on his dastardly brothers. But what does he do instead? He forgives them. and he weeps with them over what they have all experienced. And he invites them to settle in Egypt, and he makes arrangements to take care of them and their families. So Joseph breaks that family cycle that's been going on for generations and generations. Joseph breaks it through forgiveness. Now, we all know that family life is kind of a mixed bag. Some of us are more fortunate than others regarding the families that raised us. My own family was very loving and nurturing, and I am so grateful for that, especially when, as a pastor, I've heard from so many people who were deeply scarred by their families growing up. So one of the main tasks for us as adults is to be honest with ourselves about the positive and the negative aspects of the family that shaped us, and for us to learn how to break the cycle like Joseph did, so that we do not in turn pass that on to the generations that follow us. How do we do that? Jesus gives us a key in our gospel reading today. He tells us to love our enemies, do good to those who hate us, bless those who curse us, and pray for those who abuse us. As I've thought about this particular statement from Jesus, sometimes it seems that it's kind of easy to pay lip service toward the idea of loving our enemies. Yeah, I love my enemies. They're kind of abstract for us. I remember when I was younger, my father telling me about his being a young man of 25 years old and waiting on board a ship off the coast of Japan, waiting for the final invasion of Japan at the end of the Second World War. And judging from the way that the Japanese had fought in the Pacific, my father and his buddies knew that they were in for a really intense battle, and that many of them would probably not survive. My father had already lost good friends in that war. And so they were so excited and relieved when Japan announced its surrender before that final invasion. Now, he and his generation had been taught to dehumanize the Japanese people with all kinds of racial slurs and stereotypes. That was the nature of war. Many years later, a Japanese Christian man came as a guest speaker to our church. He was Pastor Yoshi Ishida, a professor at the Lutheran seminary in Chicago. Pastor Ishida had grown up on the island of Okinawa, and as a teenager during the war had been forced to work in a bomb factory to help make the bombs that killed many Americans. And he also had lost members of his family killed by American forces. And as a child, I remember witnessing my father and Pastor Ishida set aside all of their past prejudices and hatreds towards one another from that war to greet one another and embrace as brothers in Christ. What may actually be harder for us than loving our enemies is to practice grace toward those who are closest to us. For it is in the intimacy of being close family and friends and neighbors that we can do the most damage to one another. These words that we read from Jesus today have often been misused to get us to accept abuse. Indeed, in past generations, many women were advised by their pastors or priests to stay in abusive marriages because of what Jesus said. The idea of turning the other cheek, for example, has been suggested by some to mean that we should simply accept mistreatment. I recently read an article about a very conservative Roman Catholic bishop in Spain who's been preaching these kinds of ideas, especially to the women in his diocese. And I was like, really? In 2019? Because you see, I don't think that's what Jesus intended. Jesus treated everyone with dignity. And I think that's the way he wants us to treat each other. One commentator suggested that the idea of turning the other cheek really means exposing the false narrative behind that kind of abusive treatment of a fellow human being. It is showing up the one who is perpetrating the violence as being a bully. So it's hard to be gracious and forgiving of those who are closest to us, most intimate with us, and yet still maintain our own dignity and respect. And I think that when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, it's because he wants us to see the whole human race as our family. We hear people in various media these days talk about human beings who are seeking asylum on our southern border as being people to be afraid of. But can we look at them through the eyes of Jesus? Can we see them not as people to be feared, but as family? Family in a desperate situation because they themselves have experienced violence and abuse. And so regardless of what you might think is the best way to achieve border security, it's important for us Christians not to dehumanize the people who are knocking at the gate, seeking a better life. We have been loved unconditionally by God. And we are therefore called to love unconditionally in return. For they are no longer the other, the enemies. They are beloved children of God, just as we are. We are all family. Amen.